Well, hey, folks, in the high-profile Karen Reed murder trial, forensic evidence has played a central role in shaping the narrative of what happened on that snowy January night when Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found unresponsive in the front yard of 34 Fairview Road, in the snow. Now, among the most debated pieces of evidence is a single hair that was found on the taillight of Reed's SUV, actually on the bumper area. This is an artifact that prosecutors argue connects the vehicle directly to John O'Keefe. So to unpack the significance of this finding, we have to understand the science behind mitochondrial DNA. This analysis, what it truly means when an expert says that a hair is 76,000 times more likely to come from John O'Keefe than from somebody else. Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Profiling Evil. I'm really glad that you're here. And before we roll into today's deep dive, just take a second, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and if you haven't done so yet, tap the notification bell so that you'll get notified whenever we drop a new episode. And hey, if you're finding this information valuable, please share Profiling Evil with your friends. It really helps us grow in this community. Now, at Profiling Evil, we try to do a little more than just rehash headlines. We like to look into the behavioral patterns, forensic evidence, and investigative tactics that often get overlooked. Today's case is a perfect example, one that's as much about what happened after the crime as about what happened during the crime and what the crime is all about itself. So let's take a closer look at the Karen Reed trial and whether the evidence is speaking louder than the doubt. Unlike nuclear DNA that's found in most forensic comparisons, it's kind of a unique DNA that's unique to the individual, except in identical twins. Mitochondrial DNA comes from the cell's mitochondrial. It's something that's passed exclusively through the maternal line. Now that means that while nuclear DNA can pinpoint a single person with high confidence, mitochondrial DNA can only link a sample to a maternal lineage. In other words, if this hair shaft that was recovered on the bumper of Karen Reed's vehicle on the rear right corner where that damaged taillight was, it can be as common in crime scenes where hairs are shed or broken, and scientists might not be able to actually retrieve the nuclear DNA. Instead, they have to return and go back to looking at it from a mitochondrial DNA area as part of this analysis. So this little hair fiber didn't have the root, that little bulb at the end of the hair, to make that DNA, the nuclear kind of DNA that you often would love to see in these kinds of cases, but you don't often get when a hair is just broken off rather than pulled out. And this is precisely what happened in this case. In fact, DNA analyst Carl Misconduct testified for the Commonwealth, stating that a company called Bode Technology conducted mitochondrial DNA testing on the hair that was discovered on that right rear bumper and taillight area of the vehicle. And they compared it to a known DNA sample from John O'Keefe. Now, Misconduct explained that he couldn't exclude John O'Keefe as the source of hair. Now, that's really interesting. He couldn't exclude him. He added, quote, whenever we have a conclusion of a probability, it includes, like in this case, where I cannot exclude John O'Keefe. That means he can't say it wasn't John O'Keefe. He said, so when we hit these kinds of statistical things, we have to give statistical analysis weight to that hair. And this is where the number of 76,000 times more likely enters into the conversation. So he's saying that hair that they recovered there's 76,000 more times that it's likely John O'Keefe's hair. Now, I want to discuss that for a moment to try to help better understand what the 76,000 statistic really means. When a forensic expert says that DNA matches are X times more likely, they're referring to a likelihood ratio, a statistical measure of how much more likely that DNA profile is if it came from the person in question. In this case, if it came from John O'Keefe versus just a random person in the population, because that would be really difficult. So, when the lab determined that the mitochondrial DNA in the hair that was recovered from Carolyn Reed's right rear bumper is 76,000 times more likely to belong to John O'Keefe than to an unrelated individual, they were not claiming with certainty, but they were expressing extremely strong statistical support for the idea that the hair came from John O'Keefe. Now, to make this a little easier to understand, let's break it down with a simple analogy using a horse race. Imagine you're at the horse races and you need to bet on one horse, but there's 76,000 horses running at the same time. Now, you're told that one of those 76,000 horses left a hoof print in the mud at the finish line. And the specialists or the experts tell you that based on that print that they recovered and examining all of those 76,000 horses, it's more likely that it came from horse number 13 than any of the other 75,999 horses. In other words, we can't prove that it was horse 13, but you could bet your paycheck that it was, because most people would say yes to those kinds of odds. The odds, they're overwhelming. That's the power of 76,000 to 1, a likelihood ratio in a forensic context that you wouldn't want to pass up. It doesn't prove without a shadow of a doubt that it was John O'Keefe's hair on that bumper and tail light. But what it does do is tell you that out of 76,000 to 1 likelihood, it was John O'Keefe's. And that is powerful, powerful scientific evidence. But here's where the defense really did what any skilled litigator would do. They attacked the limits of the science. In cross-examination, Jackson emphasized that the mitochondrial DNA cannot distinguish between maternal relatives. That's true. If John O'Keefe had a sister, a niece, a maternal cousin, their mitochondrial DNA profile would be indistinguishable in this test. And all the defense has to do is create doubt. But how realistic is it that one of O'Keefe's relatives, not him, were hit by that bumper and forced to leave that hair on the bumper? Now, you can say it was a conspiracy and somebody meticulously placed that hair on the bumper, but I think that's just not probable. So the key question isn't whether somebody could match this thing, it's whether anyone who's relevant to this case matched that hair. And as far as publicly known information goes, there's no other maternal relative of John O'Keefe present at or near the scene of that crime that night. So, while Jackson was technically accurate, the relevance of the objection may fall flat unless the defense can identify another person from O'Keefe's maternal lineage who's plausibly there depositing that hair. You got to hand it to the defense, though, hammering home the elephant in the room. The more damning point raised by the defense wasn't about the strength of the DNA match. It was about who wasn't tested. Nicholas Bradford, another DNA analyst for the prosecution, acknowledged that he was never asked to compare DNA samples to several other key individuals, especially those who were suspected to be part of this so-called conspiracy. Now, the selective testing did raise eyebrows, and it leaves me wondering why the state didn't just go the extra mile and simply rule out other possible sources. That would have thrown water right on the defense's claims, and it would have killed this thing right out of the gates. But I want to make it really clear. I personally trust the science. In my opinion, the hair on Karen Read's tail light or bumper, based on mitochondrial DNA testing, is extremely likely to have come from John O'Keefe. In fact, 76,000 to 1 likelihood, and that's a compelling statistic. But we have to accept the fact that mitochondrial DNA is not infallible. It can't distinguish between members of the same maternal line without nuclear DNA. And it can't offer the level of certainty often seen in popular media portrayals of forensic science. But still, unless the defense can identify another realistic source for that hair, somebody from O'Keefe's maternal line, somebody who would have had a reason to be brushing up against Karen Read's vehicle, the forensic evidence is incredibly damaging. And I hope the prosecution finds a way to powerfully drive home this message. I personally believe it's true, and I believe the hair belonged to John O'Keefe. Now, while defense attorneys argue alternative theories involving this cover-up, a cover-up that allegedly was part of a botched investigation, the untested suspects, that the prosecution has assembled a narrative built on digital forensics that are fake. All of that is really troubling because I believe they did build it on accurate forensics, accurate physical evidence, accurate witness accounts, and I believe Read's own behavior before and after O'Keefe's death. But let me remind you of what we've learned so far in this case. Number one, I want to talk through some of the evidence. The Commonwealth has painted a picture of a turbulent relationship between Karen Read and John O'Keefe, with underlying resentment and tension that they say culminated on the night of his death. Now, witnesses and messages indicate that the couple had been drinking heavily throughout the evening of January 28, 2022. There's also those who suggest that the relationship was strained, especially in the weeks leading up to the incident, citing Read's frustration with O'Keefe's perceived emotional distancing. Now, these elements, prosecution's arguing, point to a moment of anger and poor judgment that might have triggered Read to back her car into O'Keefe, possibly not even realizing the full extent of her actions at that time. And that brings me to the vehicle telematics and the sudden reversal at a critical moment. I think one of the most compelling pieces of digital evidence is coming from that black box data, the data on Karen Read's Lexus SUV. The Commonwealth presented data showing that Read's vehicle suddenly reversed at about 12:21 a.m., around the same time that O'Keefe's phone and activity stopped, suggesting a possible catastrophic event. Now, there's some question around the timing and the new evidence that's coming in to suggest that this lag time on O'Keefe's phone to the telematics actually were exactly the same time. Prosecutors will argue that this rapid reverse correlates with the movement of O'Keefe when he was struck, leaving him incapacitated and ultimately leading to his death. This timeline directly supports the theory that Read struck O'Keefe with her SUV while attempting to turn around in the narrow street in front of that house. Now, the hair, it's again worth repeating. We've even talked about it already, but it's worth repeating. It was discovered on the bumper of Read's vehicle or near the tail light, and forensic testing revealed that the hair was 76,000 times more likely to have come from O'Keefe than from somebody who wasn't related to him. Acknowledging the fact that the mitochondrial DNA can't distinguish between maternal relatives, there creates some issues, but there were no identified relatives at the scene. This further solidifies the argument that O'Keefe was in proximity to or in contact with the rear of Read's vehicle at some point, consistent with the reverse impact scenario. And don't forget about Karen Read's own words, her texts, her voicemails, and the "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Following the incident, Reed's own words and actions have become a real focal point for prosecutors. I think several behaviors and the statements stand out, such as the multiple texts and voicemails, many which sounded desperate, accusatory, or even remorseful, including phrases such as, "Are you dead?" Those things are going to be incredibly damning and difficult to get past. When Karen Reed returned to the scene with her friends, she allegedly said, "I hit him. I hit him. I hit him," as she saw O'Keefe's body in the snowbank. And what many people think is the most damning statement being attributed to Reed was when she asked McCabe to Google "how long to die in the cold." How long to die in the cold? She just typed it badly. A statement that feels more like crisis management than confusion, at least according to the state. Now, these statements could be interpreted as a consciousness of guilt. Now, the defense has countered that Reed was distraught and emotionally overwhelmed, but the context, the timing, and the specificity of the phrases carries an additional amount of weight that I think is compelling. And I also found it compelling from a behavioral standpoint that when they reached 34 Fairview Road that morning to look for O'Keefe, Reed allegedly directed them exactly where to stop, pointing toward the snowbank where O'Keefe's body was ultimately found. She didn't go out and search the entire property. She didn't go and knock on the door first. She walked straight to the location where John O'Keefe's body was laying under the snow, as if she knew where he would be. And for the prosecution, and frankly for me, this is not coincidence. It's proof that she already knew what happened, and likely she already caused it. And that, to me, is incredibly compelling, and I hope the prosecution drives that home. And don't forget about the glass evidence at the scene and the body. Investigators reportedly recovered broken taillight glass at the scene and in O'Keefe's clothing and skin. Notably, there were glass shards consistent with Reed's Lexus taillight embedded in O'Keefe's clothing and even in his skin, suggesting direct impact, including glass in his nose that she says she pulled out. Now, the broken taillight on Reed's SUV matches the damage that was found at the scene, and it matches the damage you might expect from a rear impact with a person, particularly someone of John O'Keefe's size and height. The forensic trail provides a tangible link between the vehicle and the victim's injuries, bolstered by the theory that he was struck by the car, not assaulted in the home. Which brings me to that autopsy I talked about in a previous video. The findings, and most importantly, the blunt force trauma on the right side, I believe are very telling. Now, the autopsy on John O'Keefe revealed this pattern of injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle, in my opinion, even though the ME says I can't say it was a motor vehicle crash. It was blunt force trauma to just one side of his body. That's not consistent with an assault that occurred in the home. I thought the blunt force trauma on that right-hand side and on the head was consistent with a side impact from a reversing vehicle, and I think it's particularly powerful. I also feel that the lack of injuries consistent with a prolonged beating, bruising and bumps and breaks and tears on different sides of his face, because a body's not going to be laying in one position, but it's going to be turning and twisting to try to avoid being hit. All being on one side just doesn't make sense for a beating. And it certainly doesn't make sense that he was bit by a dog. And I know I'm going to get angry responses for that, but the science, in my opinion, doesn't support it. And there was no dog DNA on the skin, in the wounds, or on the clothing. These findings, in my opinion, are critical in supporting the Commonwealth's timeline and the mechanics of the injury. But I want to keep going with some unexplained damage to Karen Reed's SUV, because prosecutors introduced photos and expert analysis of the rear passenger side of Reed's vehicle, showing what they felt were scratches, dents, and damage. There was evidence suggesting that somebody had attempted to cover up or minimize the damage both physically and with comments that were made. Now, if the Commonwealth can convincingly present this to the jury, it could demonstrate some post-incident consciousness of guilt and show some efforts to obscure what really happened. From digital forensics to mitochondrial DNA to physical injuries and Reed's own words, the Commonwealth's case against Karen Reed is built upon layers of corroborative evidence. Each piece, in its own right, sparks debate, but together they start forming a powerful, albeit circumstantial, narrative that places Karen Reed at the scene, behind the wheel, and in emotional turmoil over what had just occurred. Now, whether the jury will view this tapestry of evidence as definitive proof of guilt remains to be seen. But one thing is clear to me. The prosecution isn't relying on any single thread to make their case. They're banking on the entire weave, and it's getting tighter with each day of testimony. Now, it might start to unravel when the defense starts their side, but I really like cases that methodically lay out the evidence, including forensic sciences, digital timelines, physical injuries, statements, admissions, maybe not confessions. All of that brings it together. And together, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the mountain of circumstantial evidence that's pointing toward her guilt. From statistical DNA matches, to broken taillights, to embedded glass in the victim's skin, the Commonwealth is building a case that in another world might have already tipped the scales of justice toward conviction. But the Karen Reed case isn't just a case that's about the facts. It's also about feelings. In the courtroom of public opinion, and potentially inside the minds of jurors, it's the emotional atmosphere of this case that could matter just as much as the evidence. Because wrapped around the body of this case, almost like a wool coat in a snowstorm, is something that's far more insidious than science. Reasonable doubt crafted, not from what's known, but from what's being invented. And perhaps even what's being ignored. So let's start with the elephant in the courtroom, the behavior of law enforcement. Because from the earliest days of this case, the police department and investigators have been accused of failing to collect, failing to test, failing to examine crucial evidence. They've been accused of ignoring potential suspects, men who were already inside the house at 34 Fairview. And they've been accused of overlooking digital records, ring camera footage, and other sources that could have told a more full story. The defense has skillfully turned these gaps of the investigation into evidence of their own. They don't need to prove that somebody else killed John O'Keefe. They just need to convince the jury that the police didn't even try to find out if somebody else might have. And as much as I dislike their demeanor, their attitude, and their attacking style, the Karen Reed team has constructed a narrative of systematic failures, and they've done it so well that it feels like this all should be built into a Netflix docuseries. But their conspiracy theory suggests that O'Keefe entered 34 Fairview Road, where he was attacked inside the house by partygoers, possibly including law enforcement officials from other agencies, who then staged the scene and then left him to die in the snow. Now, their theory suggests that people in that home, police officers, again, from differing agencies, first responders who came to the scene, emergency room personnel who received the body of John O'Keefe, follow-up investigators, medical examiners, and the judge are all in on a conspiracy to wrongly accuse a woman that nobody had ever heard of before the Karen Reed case began. That's quite a conspiracy, and frankly, I think it's a bunch of malarkey. Now, to many of you, this sounds implausible, maybe even desperate, but to others, it feels right. And when the facts are complex, Jurors often rely on their gut. Jurors are human beings. They're sitting in a courtroom where a single woman is accused of a brutal crime. And while the prosecution appears protective of the blue line, they also wonder if they're shielding potential suspects from scrutiny. I don't believe it. But they've seen the footage of Karen Read crying, panicking, screaming that if she hit him, or did she hit him, or could I have hit him, all of that has left them with many questions that remain unanswered. Not because the answers are unknown, but because the questions were perhaps never even asked by police. And that can plant a seed of doubt. And in a criminal trial, a single seed can grow into an acquittal. And if this case ends in an acquittal or another hung jury, it might not be because the evidence isn't there. It might be because the investigation didn't inspire confidence. When the system doesn't seem to follow its own rules, it gives jurors permission to abandon the presumption of reality. This becomes especially true when the defense doesn't need to prove an alternate scenario, only suggest that it isn't Karen Read. If jurors find themselves saying, well, it could have happened that way, then the burden of proof isn't just challenged, it collapses. And in the end, the jury might find themselves less motivated by did Karen Read kill John O'Keefe than the haunted memory they have of do I trust the people who are accusing her and telling me that she did all this. That's where beyond a reasonable doubt becomes a mirror, not just of evidence, but of trust in the very institution charged with delivering justice. So what happens when a trial's strongest evidence is diluted by the weakest investigative integrity? You get what we're watching unfold in real time in this case. A courtroom where truth fights for space alongside theory, and where guilt, it could lose to doubt, not because it's false, but because it wasn't protected from skepticism. If Karen Read walks free, it won't necessarily be because she didn't kill John O'Keefe. It may be because too many people failed to do their jobs properly, and the jury noticed. And in that moment, the justice system won't just be on trial. It will be the reason for its own undoing. And that's going to wrap it up for today's episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so I hope you'll head over to the comments section below and get in some comments. Don't be shy about jumping in the conversation with other people. But as always, try to be respectful and constructive, especially in this one. Don't come in here and hammer people. Please be professional and constructive in your critiques. Hey, thanks for watching Profiling Evil. Your support is really important. And I hope you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, where you'll get more insights, more updates, more behind-the-scenes content. And if you like audio podcasts on the go, check out Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're hungry for even more true crime content, visit profilingevil.com, where you'll find our interactive story maps, our exclusive content, and our digital newsletter, The Bolo. It's the best way to stay connected and get insider updates delivered straight to your inbox. The only way you're going to get that thing is going to profilingevil.com and signing up. Hey, and don't forget to check out my true crime books, Deceived, which is the inside story of my investigation into one of the most twisted cults in American history. And I think you'd like She Knew No Fear, the chilling and ultimate redemptive tale of my great-great-grandmother's murder and how I solved that thing 130 years later. If you live in the U.S. and you buy it through profilingevil.com, I'll sign it and I'll ship it to you for free. Anywhere else in the world, you can get Deceived or She Knew No Fear through Amazon. And make sure you're watching and waiting for my new book that's coming out next month. I think you're going to really enjoy that one. Hey, thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.